Thank you everyone for joining us today for the Comet community meeting. I know that as it gets closer to the end of the year, online meetings become more difficult, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We've already covered the housekeeping. We're leaving the ability to open your mic open, so we can take some questions in between the sessions, and we have a long Q&A session at the end of the presentations today. So I first want to start off by giving some context, particularly because we've got quite a few new people joining us today. So we'll cover some context on Comet. So for those of you that are new to Comet, our goal is improving the quality of persistent identifier metadata, which is essential to research, discovery, traceability, and evaluation. And if you go to our website, our blog post, which is linked over here, the best place for you to learn more about Comet and the model is in this blog post on the Comet model, which is based on 3 foundational principles. We're recognizing that PID metadata requires collective stewardship because there are many stakeholders involved in research that can add value beyond those that are the original depositors of the PID metadata. And when we bring these stakeholders together in a way that provides our enrichment efforts openly, and we act in transparent ways through our processes, and we follow best practices of collective governance, we can build trust, and that leads to a collective benefit for all of those involved. So all ships rise when we work together because we are part of a broader open movement, and we'll give some examples of that today in our pilot project update. So Comet started as a group of people who had discussions at Force 11 and the Paris Conference on Open Research Information. This was last year. And since then, through extensive community engagement, it's evolved into a diverse group. If we're just looking at the people who have signed up to our newsletter, that's currently over 140 people who are supporting Comet and the work that we're doing together. So Comet is organized as a collaborative initiative currently by PKP, the Public Knowledge Project, CWTS out of the Leiden University, California Digital Library, and DataCite. And I'm joined today by my fellow organizers who will be jumping into the conversation and into the chat and into the discussion generally. So as I mentioned, we're in a phase where we are focused on pilot projects to demonstrate that the Comet model works. Today, in particular, we're going to be focusing in on one project on the high value affiliation use case. And that is the project of CRIS systems and how we can de-silo the quality metadata that exists in CRIS systems. We know that it's there, but currently the benefits are primarily isolated and working only for that particular institution. So that is our focus of the conversation for today. And we're going to start with a perspective from Cristina from Wageningen University and Research. We'll then get an update on the results of our pilot project, which includes both Wageningen and EMBL. Then we'll get a different perspective from Diego on how a collaboration of multiple universities in Colombia are treating enrichments from CRIS systems and more broadly in the Colombian research space. I want to make sure that we leave lots of time for your questions and ideas and perspective on information from CRIS systems. So we have left a long section for discussion at the end. And so with that done, I will hand over to Cristina.
Hi everyone. I won't have slides, so I won't go through slides, but I've looked through what comes over, so I'm not going to go into numbers or the general explanation of the pilot project, but I would like to talk a little bit about the our own motivation for being part of this. And if there are any questions or suggestions after, more than happy to have a conversation. So as probably most people here, we also work on curating our data in CRIS systems, but we also want to make more and more use of the open data out there. And so how can we, on the one hand, feel like we make a difference globally while still being incredibly valuable for our own university? And also a kind of a side note that came out of this pilot project for us was that actually open data is good enough for what we need it for. And we were planning to do those analyses anyway, but now that it happened, there's just an extra bonus. Moving forward, because in our own CRIS system, I'm sure it happens in other places as well. There are kind of two rules that we have to go through. On the one hand, the internal policy on what should be in the CRIS system, which again kind of splits in two, and they're related to the policy that each university has, because for us, we use the data within our CRIS system for promotion and tenure. So we only need publications from researchers that are currently here. And that is something that we will also need to think through if we reroute towards using open data. How do we keep publication? How do we keep out things that we don't need? On the one hand, because they don't comply with policy. On the other, and this is also a conversation we'll be having with Adam separately, people that misuse our affiliation. And those are actually easier to leave out because we have, of course, an integration with our HR system. So if it's not there, then they're not ours. But the other ones, in terms of complying with our internal policy, it's something that we still need to figure out. It's not impossible, but we need to get through it. And in many ways, we have a bit of a kind of advantage in some way, because we were already doing quite a bit of automated curation of metadata. And we're planning on improving this further. We actually have a separate pilot going on as I speak. It started last week, and it will go on for 2-3 weeks just to set up the foundation. But ultimately, we want to go into a way more automated way of dealing with metadata curation and like data quality automation on top. And probably I'll reach out to Adam when things are a bit more clear to give feedback on that as well. But ultimately, I won't go into the information that's already in the slides, but I do feel like it has been a very useful way of looking at the data through very different lenses, but also it started out the conversation internally. How can we be useful outside of the boundaries of our own university? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cristina. So is there any questions you want to take for Cristina now before we jump over to Adam? Nope. Okay, well, I'm sure lots will come once we get the demonstration from Adam on the actual specifics of the pilot. So Adam, I will hand over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Adam Buttrick. I'm one of the organizers of Comet based at the California Digital Library. I'm here today to talk about the work that we did for our pilot project on leveraging curation from CRIS systems. So to kind of reinforce and reiterate a bit what Cristina was just describing, we know that research institutions invest significant time and effort into creating a comprehensive account of their output in tools like CRIS systems. This curation work is incredibly valuable. It involves lots of manual searching and meticulous review by institutions, doing things like disambiguating and verifying complex author affiliations, accounting for all kinds of data gaps and errors in the source descriptions, and otherwise working to maintain accurate and comprehensive local metadata. So truly awesome and important work. The question is then, how can we better leverage this effort in open infrastructures? So we know that institutions care deeply about the representation in these sources as they shape how they're perceived and assessed. But despite this investment, there remain these significant gaps between what institutions know about their own outputs and their ability to bring that knowledge to bear in other settings. This disconnect means that valuable institutional knowledge is being underutilized to improve the scholarly record, while automated enrichment processes continue to struggle with the gaps and edge cases that this curation work is actually really great at addressing. Next slide, please. So then, in thinking about how Comet could bridge the gaps here, what we saw as an opportunity was to prototype a scalable reconciliation strategy for two data sources. First, of course, CRIS system curation, and then the large-scale enrichment work being done in OpenAlex. So for this pilot project, we also wanted to take into account our fields as features approach, and so narrowly target author affiliations, seeing if we could take a minimum viable set of inputs from an institution's CRIS curation, things we know that folks have, like list of their DOIs, their associated authors, institutional name variants, and use these inputs to query, better understand, and ideally improve metadata in a source like OpenAlex. Next slide, please. Now, to do this, we could try using the OpenAlex API, but to do so would involve many and kind of complex queries, lots of paging through results, and would just generally be a bit inefficient, also cost money to do all those queries. So the approach we took was to use the equally great data file access they provide to put together an analytical database that includes all author affiliation pairings in their data, normalizing them, and then mapping their relationships to DOIs and work records. So not every work record in OpenAlex has a DOI. Then what we can do is what I described before, take the curated list of institutional publications, as well as the known name variants for the institution, and use these to pull as much information as we can from OpenAlex, know more about the work the institutions are doing, as well as hopefully find opportunities to make the metadata better. Next slide, please. So briefly, how this works. We take the input data and we normalize all the name metadata in the same way that occurs when we pull in those OpenAlex records. So essentially use the same normalization procedures on the inputs as is used to create the database. For each work in the input, we see if the author is linked to the institution by way of fuzzy author and affiliation string matching, capturing all the overlap and discrepancies that result from this process. For all matched affiliations, we return both the raw and normalized forms of these affiliation strings. So what it looks like with case, punctuation, all the messiness, and then a very clean form of that affiliation string. From the former, the raw strings, we extract the named entities that are most similar to our known institutional name variants. Remember, this is an input list of known variant names. We take both of these the extracted entities and the normalized affiliation strings, and then query our database for all instances of both that occur as affiliations on works. Next slide, please. So what we then have as outputs are first a linkage validation file. This shows for every DOI in the input whether the same author affiliation pairs occurred in OpenAlex, flagging any discrepancies. For example, where the institution said one of their authors is on a paper, but this affiliation or royalty assignment is missing. Then, as I said, we also find all other works that can be derived from these inputs, searching for all instances of the same or similar affiliations, and ideally, returning the full list of works for a given institution. This, I think, is pretty powerful and cool because with a sample of the curated works, what we can do is blow things up to get at the big picture. But then what these outputs also allow is for the institutions to check their curation against OpenAlex, pinpoint discrepancies, potentially make interventions, as well as find more of their own research outputs that weren't surfaced by other means. Next slide, please. So I describe all of this as if it sprung forth fully formed, but actually what happened is that it was developed through lots of iterative refinement through two great pilot partners who are on the call with us today. Wageningen University and Research, who we heard from with Cristina, and then EMBL, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. So to assess the efficacy of the reconciliation strategy's final form, what we did was test with CRIS curation data from their systems using 1 year as input and then holding out another year as a kind of test set. Next slide. Talking through the results for EMBL first, using their curated work set from 2023 as an input and known works from 2024 as a test set, our automated search strategy was able to match about 90% of their curated works. In addition, we were able to discover and confirm new works that had not previously been found through their manual search and curation. For the 10% that were missed, the reconciliation strategy also helped us to pinpoint why the works in the input could not be discovered. So for about half of these missed works, the search strategy itself actually hadn't failed. Instead, these resulted from gaps in the upstream data. So specifically for these cases, OpenAlex's affiliation parsing had failed to extract the EMBL affiliation, most often when it was listed as the second or third affiliation on a work. For the other 5%, okay, that's on us. We need to do some additional investigation into why these specific entries were missed. We potentially need a bigger input to capture the true breadth of affiliation variance, or the matching logic itself needs some further refinement, either on the author side or on the affiliation side. When we zoom out a little bit and look at all the works for the test year in OpenAlex, so this is our slide on the right. Oh, do we have some questions in the chat? Is there documentation on the fuzzy name matching? Yes, there is, Arthur. It's in the code repository. I'll talk about it at the end. Have not looked at those W3C reconciliation format, but sounds very cool. Would love to take a look at that. Okay, looking at this chart on the right-hand side, when we zoom out a bit and look at all works for the test year in OpenAlex, so those that we matched and those that we should have found, we find some interesting results. So 83% looked up the correct author affiliation ROR ID assignments. 12% appeared to have an EMBL affiliation string, but without the ROR ID assigned. And the remainder are essentially affected by that same author affiliation parsing gap. You might naturally be thinking that ROR ID coverage is a bit low relative to the available affiliations. But when we kind of dive in and look at the data a bit more closely, what we observe is a few different things. First, for its affiliation string matching, OpenAlex relies heavily on ROR as a source of truth for name variants to match against. In reviewing those missed ROR ID assignments, what we see are many authors using EMBL plus city names, so Grenoble, Heidelberg, for these national level labs. And we actually don't have those as name variants in ROR. So, oh no, mea culpa. I'm the product manager for ROR. We need to get those added, at which point they should actually be picked up and matched a whole lot better in OpenAlex. We'll do this in our next release, so in a few weeks' time. Similarly, there are affiliations that list just simply EMBL or European molecular biology without further qualifications. And these are kind of ripe for unresolvable collisions. Essentially, any matching strategy needs to know which of the EMBLs were intended to pick the right ROR ID, so they need to be qualified with place name. But in all cases, what this provided was exactly the kind of focused and actionable feedback needed to identify gaps and support improvements. Also, a great example then in our work on Comet, there are really no gotchas. Instead, just kind of constant reminders that we, all of us, can look more, do more, and make things better as a community. Next slide, please. Okay, moving to Wageningen University. This was a quite different but equally valuable scenario. As Chris highlighted, Wageningen's CRIS curation work follows a far more complex set of exclusions, including by sources and work types. And accounting for these local specificities was kind of beyond the scope of the pilot, but was nonetheless like super instructive, providing, like me, who hasn't done a lot of this work, with an on-the-ground view of how a team works hard to sort all of the signal from the noise, with lots of details that can hopefully actually inform additional and more complex work on joining together these data sources in the future. But after some feedback and back and forth discussion, we were, however, able to review a single test year and resource type for this analysis, such that we could do comparison against the match plus missed EMBL results. For these, we were able to identify that 92% of works had the correct author affiliation of ROR ID assignments, 2% failed to match the ROR ID, and 6% were affected by the author affiliation parsing issues. What's cool, for these parsing errors, what we saw was very similar gaps as those found for EMBL. So again, being kind of clustered around a similar set of sources, as well as occurring relative to Wageningen being the second or third affiliation on a work. So if we can fix some of those issues, we'll likely have a large impact across the entire data set. We also found a tiny sliver of new works, which truly unimpressive in number, really unimpressive, like 10, 15. Kind of cool that we can catch some that might have otherwise slipped through the cracks. Next slide, please. But to me, what this pilot demonstrated was that this kind of strategy was not only viable for doing this kind of analysis and reconciliation at scale, but also created value in many directions. For the institution, they get a fast and automated way to validate their local curation against OpenAlex, find new works, and surface a clear and actionable list of gaps to address. The infrastructure, in this case, actually both OpenAlex and ROR, likewise can get targeted reproducible feedback on data gaps from a high quality data source, which when we think about it is really the only kind of sustainable way to improve this data. When we're working at this scale, what we need are quick ways to assess what looks right, what looks wrong, try and understand what results in both states so we can intervene in efficient and comprehensive way. But what this pilot also provides is a clear step in the direction of institutions leveraging the hard work that they are already doing in their local systems to improve the scholarly record for everyone. And I see we've had some other questions in the chat, so let me pause for a second to address those. Yes, Anne, my old friend Anne, yes, this pilot will absolutely be used to improve ROR metadata. We're going to go in and we're going to add some of those additional variant names to EMBL. OpenAlex affiliation matching should pick them up. We've done similar things relative to work that I know that you've collaborated on in France. So, where, for example, including French research unit codes as aliases. And then Victoria, could you tell why the second and third affiliations are more prone to errors? It's a good question. That can be a little bit hard to pin down. In some cases, this could be the result of landing page parsing, where essentially OpenAlex is trying to grab the author affiliations from landing pages, and for some reason, something in the code makes those second or third affiliations fall off. Can't really know without doing a lot of kind of technical investigation to that problem. This can also be an issue for PDF parsing utilities as well, though. They tend to be very good at capturing kind of linear relationships between authors and affiliations. So it's like one author, one affiliation. But when there's like, for example, large affiliation lists with lots of complicated subscripts, and you have to kind of, it's hard even for a person to match all of those together and make the correct associations. Similarly, those can fall off. Chris has a question. How does this process account for authors who have multiple affiliations and choose under which affiliations to submit, or authors who may have conducted work at one or more institution moving to another institution by the time the paper was submitted? So some of that is captured more broadly. There are complex semantics around which affiliation an author might use for a given piece of work, and no doubt different perspectives on which is the right affiliation. How will those be resolved? All good questions. Maybe a little bit of out of scope for what we are trying to target. Some of it would be addressed by the way that the input data and the test data were bounded to these CRIS curation inputs. So for example, we essentially treat EMBL and what Wageningen says as the source of truth, and we use to say this is what should be the correct work, correct set of works for a given year. But it's true that if an author essentially is affiliated with an institution but uses a second or third kind of or uses an additional affiliation that's not associated with that institution on a work, perhaps the institution has a perspective that should be accounted to them. That's where I would actually like to hear more maybe from how the CRIS folks kind of handle these cases. Obviously, as Cristina mentioned, they have some internal knowledge about who's employed with them. So that might include things like ORCID IDs that can be used then to link it back to the institution so that they know all of their ORCIDs. Can we use ORCID employment data for that? Yeah, so Ted, yeah, you're anticipating what I was about to say. Yes. I agree that, yeah. So if we could also pull in ORCID data, we could probably capture it in CRIS curation systems, have knowledge of all of their authors' ORCIDs. We could definitely leverage this in the same way to match and associate those affiliations. Okay, can we pull up the next slide?
Sure.
So in terms of next steps, we flagged the issues that we found with affiliation parsing to OpenAlex for further investigation, but we should also really give them a lot of credit here. They're already doing a fantastic job of weaving together a very complex web of sources, closing the gaps on author affiliations that exist across them, such that institutions can get a lot of value from incorporating and engaging with them as part of their CRIS curation workflows. And I think as Cristina was hinting at, Likewise, their new user curation functionality should empower institutions to directly intervene on some of these issues our reconciliation strategy expose. And let's not forget to always do more curation, me, you, everybody. So OpenAlex has the right name variants to match against. Circling back to the pilot work itself, we're also looking at ways that this kind of reconciliation can be formalized and scaled, including things like harvesting these institutional assertions from OAI PMH endpoints, as I believe is already being done by services like OpenAir, as well as looking how to incorporate different kinds of inputs and fields. So the point that Chris was just raising about including ORCID IDs as a signal to find the correct kind of associations and institutional assertions. As we'll hear from Diego in just a moment, there's actually some very cool work being done to derive author affiliations using different sources and methods than what I've outlined here. So lots of opportunity. Okay, that's all from me. I want to give a special thanks to our partners at EMBL and Wageningen for their collaboration and all the great insights and feedback they provided during this pilot. I love working on these pilots because I learn a lot about what people are doing and how abstract or simplified models don't maybe match with all of those complexities. Thanks also to OpenAlex for putting together their great services and trove of metadata, making all this possible in the first place and otherwise engaging with us on this work. I also want to mention that as always, and as Arthur was asking about, the code for this pilot is all open source. So check that out if you think it might be of use or interest. And I think I'm going to turn things over to Diego now to talk about the work at CoLav.
I know that Victoria from EMBL is also here and was very involved in the pilot. I'm not sure if you want to share anything, Victoria, before we move on.
I just want to add that for us, a big part of this is understanding that there is a use for what we're doing and knowing that this can go somewhere. So far, the curation that's been done, it just sits in a commercial CRIS system and it's not interoperable with any of the open research information databases. And another part of this is that since we are an intergovernmental organization with many member states, we care a lot about reporting on collaboration. So we actually curate more than our own affiliation. So I think if more institutions and universities move towards this direction to collectively verify and ensure that the public metadata is accurate, it can really benefit a much larger community. And that's all. And we also got a lot of new publications out of this to improve our own process. So I think many institutions could benefit from this pilot. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Victoria. I think there are a couple of questions, or is it just chatter? I'm going to scan up.
Yeah, I can address those in the chat, and then we can circle back after Diego.
Okay. So I am talking about our Curation proposal from Impact 2 that is CRIS system for all Colombia that already has around 1 million works in OpenAlex, for example. We are combining this information with local information, mainly with the main scientific database in Colombia that is called CIENTI. This is directly from the Ministry of Science in Colombia. In this platform, each researcher in Colombia needs to input manually the information of all their works. And the research system in Colombia is such that each group of researchers is organized into research groups, and the research group need to verify the information. So through this kind of link, we will see later the affiliation is automatically established. Moreover, in Colombia, the scientific production is part of the normal salary of the professor. So each institution needs to track each article that is produced by the researcher. And in this way, we have another additional database to have valuable metadata. So at the end, the advantage of this is that each researcher is uniquely identified with national identifiers. And the problem is that this information is manually generated that have a lot of problems that we already fixed, by the way, with OpenAlex. We have for the participant university, we have access directly to the Oracle database with all these full information. And for the other institution, the government publish from time to time open data sets with this kind of information. The idea then is to process this information into some system in which each word is completely identified. In particular, for every specific word with EDOI, for example, we are able to identify the research group, and the research group is automatically associated to one institution. In this way, we can associate one author with one specific institution. So the system at the end is based in OpenAlice. We combine with around 500,000 of products from Colombia at the journal from Colombia that can find authors that are not Colombian. And we combine with local databases, especially this 21. We can see that there is a good quantity of articles that are not that have no affiliation information in OpenAlice, but we can track with our method. And the idea is to focus in this part for these applications. So we have several sources database to fill the institution information, obviously OpenAlice, and when OpenAlice pays, we have this scientific database, the DSpace of each institution in Colombia. We're already harvesting 150 DSpaces from all the institutions in Colombia. And also we have the report from each institution and its production. And finally, the open data from MinCiencias that is similar to this one, but a little bit more simplified. So with this, we are able to identify very well each profile, author profile from Colombian authors. For example, for this author that usually appear as Oscar Zapata, we are able to gather all the production and fully identify him with local and national identifiers. For example, for Latin America countries, in particular for Colombia, it's very usual for the author to have 2 names and 2 last names, and we are able to identify all of them. And besides, the people usually use a simplified version of the names to fill the affiliation in their works. And with this, we are able to identify properly the affiliation at the level of the institution and inside the faculties and departments, for example. Here, for example, is the research group to which these researchers belongs, and with this, we are able to fulfill all the metadata. So at the end, from this number of 500,000 of products from Colombia, we were able to identify, for example, 9,000 works that doesn't have affiliation for one specific Colombian author, and we are able to fix this kind of information with our system for these 9,000 words. And we already sent a sample of this data to the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego. It's just such an exemplary example of the good work that your team is doing and collaborating together. And it's so great that we can bring this and share this with everyone in the Comet community. I'm also loving how active the chat is. There are so many questions, and I think Adam is doing a good job of answering what he can as we go. I'm going to take back the screen, if that's okay. And then we'll hand over to everyone on the floor to ask questions and share other ideas. Please go for it. Does everyone see an icon to raise your hand? Okay. Would anyone like to go for it? Perhaps another example of how your work at your institution could roll into the examples that we've shown today?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Diego.
What was the question? Sorry.
I was just opening the floor to anyone who wants to add from their perspective, from their institution, how they are creating their metadata, if there's similarities between what your team is doing, if it could work in the pilot approach that we've described today.
And yes, this is a work in progress. I just to emphasize that for the affiliation, you just normalize that data with raw identifier, so it's very easy. Once you have the DOI and the proper raw identifier to generate some methodology to harvest this kind of improvements.
Yeah, definitely. There's also a thread in the chat about competing kind of forms of authority. So the authority that's derived from, what is mined from a work, the authority that's derived from what is curated by a work from a CRIS institution, the authority that an author has to assert, which institution by which they're affiliated. And I agree, those are all very complex and thorny issues. But essentially, by taking all of these different kind of things and putting them together and seeing where they overlap or where they disagree, we can actually just immediately derive a lot of value from that exercise where we see, oh, one account has this, but another doesn't. Why? Is this a systematic issue? What is the available data that could be used to kind of address these things? So we didn't really encounter too much of that in the immediate kind of CRIS data that we worked with, but that could also be because it was relatively small. As I said, we used a single year for the input, and it's another year for the test set. But yeah, I think when you really start diving into the weeds of everything, there's a lot of complexity there. Like for example, I was like, when we were working with Wageningen, we found all of these works, and I was like, great, we found so many of these works. Look at all of this stuff that wasn't in your input for this year. And they're like, yeah, we exclude those for this complex set of rules and heuristics, and we don't include these sources or those sources. So figuring out how to incorporate and balance that, I think could also provide a lot of value. Chris has his hand raised.
Yeah, hi everybody. Very interesting discussion. Good to hear progress update. I was curious whether the CRIS-derived affiliation data and I guess the publication-derived original affiliation data are both being preserved and separately annotated in the OpenAlex data, or is one replacing the other?
Yeah, so in this case, where we haven't actually ingested any data into OpenAlex, I don't know how that's going to work in their future curation workflow, but we're essentially just looking at the data and identifying the existing overlap and gaps, assuming some normalization that's kind of like a sane level, so normalizing for case, for punctuation, for those kind of things. But yeah, that's a good question when you're trying to really make these kind of synthetic kind of data sources, like who has priority in terms of what is asserted. In some cases, like where we have parsing errors, there are essentially like known issues or gaps. So Wageningen actually provided a lot of really good and useful feedback on individual works, essentially like whether the error was an affiliation is fully missing, or if it was partially extracted or something like that, relative to the account that they have. So you can make an argument in favor of incorporating, like that level of review and expertise directly into the affiliation. At the same time, you could say, this derived method is the source of truth. What the publisher asserts is the source of truth. So lots of competing claims.
Yeah, if I could just respond, I mean, I think from the ORCID's perspective, as you know, kind of individual ORCID record holders are curators of their own data, but we always preserve detailed provenance information on the source of every assertion. whether that's the researchers themselves or a system that's integrated with ORCID. And I think that's probably a really important principle here, right? Because the reality is there is no one truth, that different use cases, different purposes for the data have different rules around them. And if you want to better sort out what data is useful for your use case after the fact, you can only do that if you have the provenance data to know where every source of every piece of information came from.
Yeah, definitely. And Bianca is raising a similar point about how provenance is being created in closed systems. So how can we think about making that provenance, even just at the level of what is being curated, just more openly available? And I think that that's a really cool goal. Like I talked about with future work around potentially harvesting all of that data, that could essentially exist as a parallel form of assertion that doesn't necessarily have to be assumed as the primary source of truth, but a source of truth, to Chris's point, that can be used and to balance kind of other sources. Bianca.
Yeah, maybe in addition to that, my last point in my comment was not only about the importance of provenance, but if that provenance points toward original data sources that are themselves not open, whether that's an issue in itself. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but it's non-checkable, it's non-verifiable.
Yeah.
So I think there's also something there.
Yeah, I think we ran into a little. Yeah, I think we ran into a little bit of that in the pilot project, in the sense that certain CRIS curation is done relative to the PDFs, which an institution might be the only ones who has access to, through their subscriptions. Whereas what OpenAlex is deriving is from something like a landing page or some other form of account. So there can be discrepancies there, just at what is asserted on the object and the availability of that object, and then how do you decide which is correct?
Any other comments or questions?
There was there's one. I want to highlight one other thing, which is Anne, who's on the call, also mentioned that in France they've been doing a lot of this work through to correct OpenAlex through a project called Works Magnet. So if you haven't read about that and kind of the wide scale curation that they've been doing, I think there's like maybe 100, 200,000 individual instances of curation and correction of raw ID assignments and affiliations. Perhaps the affiliations themselves, I can't remember the full scope. That's really cool. They have that available as a fully open data set. There's lots of write-ups on that, so make sure you check that out.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, well, with just a few minutes left, I wanted to share some ideas on how people can get involved in the project. When I was looking at all of the signups for this meeting, the primary comment that came out was, how can we get involved? How can we get involved? Which is really great to see. So at the moment, we are, as you know, focused on our pilot projects and finishing the pilot projects, and also securing longer term funding for Comet. In the meantime, we are taking interest from those who are wanting to contribute, whether it's their curated metadata or whether it's the process that they are using to get to that created metadata. We want to hear about all of those approaches. So there is a form on our website. This QR code takes you to the Join Us page, which has a number of different ways that you can get involved. The one way is to go to it's the Contribute Enrichments form, and that asks you a number of questions where you can describe the metadata you're producing and the process that you have. And we'll keep that and we'll be in touch as soon as we're able to act on those projects. Of course, the pilot projects are still in progress, and please get involved in those. On our website, you will see that each project has an open Google document for anyone to comment on. It has detail on the project itself, where we are. Please jump into those, ask questions, add your comments. We're also going to be running project assessments where we take a look back on how each project went, and we get the community's view on how the results of the project, what we learned, and how that can inform the future of Comet's direction. So we'll be sharing more information about that soon. We've done one of them so far, and we will do another one for this project very soon. Then save the date for our next community meeting. That is happening on the 21st of January next year. And we'll be sharing more information on that in the coming weeks. Of course, the main way to keep informed is to sign up on our newsletter, on our website. There we'll be sharing a number of blog posts and continue to share the updates on our projects. And you will also find us on Blue Sky if you're active there, and on LinkedIn. And all our code is available on GitHub. If you're a GitHub user, follow us there too. And that is it. I just wanted to say a big thank you for everyone to joining us again. And Juan Pablo is sharing an article. I'm not sure if that's relevant to what we've just discussed.
Just about the works magnet. It was just providing background for what the conversation was. So I posted the link to the works magnet page, but also there was an article that Eric posted recently explaining a bit more about it. So just for people that wanted to follow up on that thread.
Great, thanks. And thank you again to our pilot partners for your participation and joining us today. And I think that is it. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so much,
everyone for coming.
everyone.